Late October 2025 witnessed Russian President Vladimir Putin stepping into the spotlight once more, this time to unveil another atomic boast. Moscow had completed testing of the Burevestnik cruise missile, an atomic-powered weapon that Putin proclaimed represented technology unmatched anywhere on the planet. Within days, the Russian leader touted the Poseidon submersible drone, allegedly impossible to detect or intercept. Yet beneath these theatrical demonstrations of atomic saber-rattling lies, a truth the Kremlin desperately wants concealed. These escalating displays of nuclear intimidation and the so-called boundaries Putin challenges adversaries to violate aren't demonstrations of power. They represent the final desperate gambit of a declining superpower clutching at its remaining leverage. Western governments are increasingly recognizing this charade for what it truly is. Throughout nearly 4 years of atomic intimidation, the international community has observed Putin establish boundaries so frequently that they've become meaningless. Examine the magnitude of Russia's nuclear coercion strategy. Voice of America's detailed documentation reveals Russian authorities issued 135 atomic warnings spanning February 2022 through December 2024. Putin personally delivered 27 of these declarations, with their occurrence intensifying progressively. The pattern began with 5 warnings in 2022, escalated to 9 in 2023, then surged to 13 in 2024. The year 2025 saw comparatively fewer warnings. United 24 Media identified merely 4 instances, with 3 concentrated within a 2-week period, including the Poseidon and Burevestnik revelations. If you're finding this analysis valuable, hit that subscribe button. We're breaking down the geopolitical shifts reshaping our world. President Donald Trump brilliantly encapsulated the ridiculousness of even entertaining the Russian president's latest missile announcement. "I know we have a nuclear submarine, the greatest in the world, right off their shores. So, it doesn't have to go 8,000 miles. And they're not playing games with us. We're not playing games with them either." His tone then shifted to visible irritation. He ought to get the war ended. A war that should have taken 1 week is now in its 4th year. That's what he ought to do instead of testing missiles. Trump's dismissal represents a pivotal moment. Rarely has a prominent Western authority avoided carefully measuring each syllable to prevent antagonizing Moscow. Instead, he's characterizing Putin's atomic posturing accurately, the frantic theatrics of a leader whose traditional military capabilities have spectacularly failed. Let's examine Russia's methodology of nuclear coercion and understand its genuine implications. Though we won't enumerate every instance, excessive repetition would result. A clear pattern emerges immediately. Whenever Ukraine or NATO achieves substantial progress, Putin resorts to his atomic playbook. The pattern has become both foreseeable and transparent. February 24, 2022. Opening day. Putin initiates his special military operation with barely disguised atomic intimidation, warning that interference with Russia would produce consequences unprecedented in your experience. Powerful rhetoric, certainly, but also Moscow's initial miscalculation. Russia essentially issued atomic threats before attempting conventional victory to isolate Ukraine internationally. February 27, 2022, Day 3. When Ukraine's rapid capitulation fails to materialize within 48 hours, Putin commands Russia's atomic arsenal into special combat readiness mode, elaborate terminology for heightened alert status. Western powers take notice. Make sure you like this video if you're learning something new. It helps us reach more people who need this information. April 20th, 2022. Russia conducts testing of the RS-28 Sarmat intercontinental ballistic missile. Roscosmos director Dmitry Rogozin had previously asserted it could annihilate any defensive shield system. Washington responded by characterizing this as routine testing with appropriate notification under New START treaty protocols. Yet the timing betrays Putin's mounting frustration as Ukrainian resistance persists. April 24, 2022. Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov cautions that sustained Western assistance for Ukraine might precipitate World War III. This warning emerges one day following U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken's meeting with Zelensky in Kyiv. Moscow's message crystallizes: cease supporting Ukraine or face consequences. The West's response? Continuing Ukrainian support regardless. Remarkably, merely 2 months into the invasion, 4 threats had already materialized. June 2022. The HIMARS. Boundary. President Joe Biden's administration contended that supplying high-mobility artillery rocket systems would constitute unacceptable provocation. Russian authorities amplified these concerns, forecasting catastrophic repercussions. Then Ukraine began securing critical battlefield victories throughout April and May. Abruptly, HIMARS didn't appear so provocative. Washington delivered them. Russia took no retaliatory action, and NATO rapidly comprehended that Russia's boundaries possessed virtually unlimited interpretative flexibility. July 2022 and March 2023. On separate occasions, former Russian President Dmitry Medvedev indicated that Ukrainian attacks on Crimea, formerly Ukrainian sovereign territory, would provoke apocalyptic responses, employing all necessary weapons, naturally suggesting atomic missiles. While the initial threat somewhat registered with Ukraine and NATO, Ukraine proceeded to develop and acquire long-range drones used against the Kherson Bridge and adjacent infrastructure. When one warning proved insufficient, Medvedev felt compelled to intensify rhetoric, yet remained ignored. September 21, 2022. Putin announces partial mobilization and proclaims, "Should our country's territorial integrity face threats, and to defend Russia and our people, we will absolutely employ all weapon systems at our disposal. This isn't posturing." Yet as Ukraine continues striking Russian territory with drones, no atomic weapons materialize. That identical month witnessed Putin annexing Donetsk, Luhansk, Kherson, and Zaporizhia, territories Russia doesn't even completely control, declaring them Russian sovereign land. The implicit warning suggested that attacking Russian territory might trigger atomic retaliation. Ukraine responded by liberating Kherson City come November, forcing Russian troops across the Dnipro River. Russia answered with intensified warnings as its forces retreated in disorder. February 2023. Germany declares it will provide Leopard tanks to Ukraine, something Putin had explicitly warned against, immediately threatening atomic repercussions. The tanks arrived from Germany, though accumulating sufficient quantities required nearly 2 years. This represented another boundary blatantly transgressed by NATO, with apparently zero consequences. June 2023. Putin announces relocating tactical atomic weapons to Belarus. This maneuver supposedly aims to unnerve the West. Instead, it becomes a symbolic gesture changing nothing operationally. Russia already maintained weapon stockpiles in Kaliningrad, arguably positioned closer to certain European capitals and definitively Russian territory. Drop a comment below. What do you think Putin's next move will be? We read every response. February 2024. Putin cautions that any NATO nations deploying troops to combat in Ukraine would encounter atomic consequences. France's President Emmanuel Macron nonetheless stated he wouldn't eliminate the possibility of dispatching European forces. Putin orders atomic weapons exercises. Ultimately, NATO dispatched no troops, and Ukraine managed to maintain positions through domestic personnel resources and remarkable innovation in drone development, compensating for numerical deficits. August 2024. Ukraine invades Kursk and initiates strikes on additional Russian territories. Putin's previous boundary declared that direct threats to Russian territory facilitated by NATO weaponry assisting Ukraine would equate to Russia-NATO war. Yet no formal war declaration materialized, and Russia required 6 months suppressing the Ukrainian Kursk incursion. Ukraine achieved this significant victory independently, prompting then-President Biden to authorize long-range ATACMS missiles against targets within Russia come November 2024. Putin's reaction proved almost predictably comical. He ratified an updated atomic doctrine that very week, reducing the threshold for atomic employment. The revised doctrine stipulates that attacks by non-nuclear nations backed by nuclear powers could trigger atomic retaliation. Subsequently, on November 19, 2024, Ukraine actually strikes a military installation in Russia's Bryansk region with ATACMS missiles. Russian Foreign Minister Lavrov characterizes this as a new phase of the Western war against Russia. Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov cautions that the doctrine now authorizes atomic response. And yet, nothing transpired. Instead, Russia launched the Oreshnik missile, an intermediate-range ballistic missile capable of carrying atomic warheads yet armed with conventional munitions, pure atomic theater, displaying what Russia could accomplish while meticulously avoiding actual follow-through. November 21, 2024. Ukraine strikes with British Storm Shadow missiles. Russia's ambassador to the UK asserts Britain is now directly participating in this conflict. Once more, The atomic threshold has purportedly been violated. Once more, no atomic weapons are deployed. Then 2025 arrives with renewed rapid succession warnings as Russia showcases its supposedly flawless systems. Yet Putin perpetuates these ineffective threats precisely because they're literally all remaining in his arsenal. Consider Russia's strategic circumstances. At the conflict's commencement, Russia possessed numerical advantage, industrial capacity, and surprise element. 3 years subsequently, it has managed occupying roughly 1% of supplementary Ukrainian territory at the expense of an estimated casualty figure approaching 1 million soldiers, with some analyses suggesting figures between 900,000 and 1.3 million total casualties, a devastated economy, and international isolation. Russia's celebrated military doctrine has proven catastrophically unsuitable for contemporary warfare. Unlike NATO forces that assimilate battlefield experience, Russia defaults to inflexible, predetermined scenarios and attritional warfare. When Russian units encounter unexpected resistance, they frequently cannot adapt. Officers cannot execute autonomous decisions. The outcome is predictable tactics that Ukrainian forces exploited repeatedly. The Hostomel airport catastrophe on day 1 established the precedent. Russia dispatched 200 to 300 special operations personnel via helicopters to capture an airfield immediately outside Kyiv. The strategy involved airlifting reinforcements and advancing on the capital. Instead, Ukrainian defenders neutralized 4 helicopters, obstructed the runways, and compelled the entire operation to abort. 18 transport aircraft carrying potentially 4,000 troops were detected approaching Hostomel, but diverted rather than landing under hostile fire. This tactical catastrophe exposed profound structural deficiencies. Putin's invasion wasn't orchestrated by Russia's military command, but by the FSB, the security apparatus. They anticipated Ukraine capitulating within 10 days. Russian forces literally didn't transport spare components for extended combat operations. Captured maps revealed no contingency for encountering enemy resistance. Putin has directly precipitated this predicament by spending 20 years systematically eliminating any possibility of receiving accurate intelligence. He surrounded himself with agreeable subordinates who communicate what he desires hearing rather than what he requires knowing. When the FSB compiled assessments about Ukraine, they carefully filtered information to align with Putin's convictions that Ukraine wasn't legitimate, that Ukrainians would embrace Russian liberators, that the West wouldn't intervene decisively. Without opposition, Russia is compelled executing directives contrary to its long-term interests. The regime that eliminated dissent to preserve control now discovers that identical absence of dissent prevents the adaptation essential for survival. Subscribe now. Don't miss our upcoming analysis on Russia's economic vulnerabilities. Consequently, Putin reaches for the atomic card repeatedly, since acknowledging the invasion as miscalculation remains impossible. That would necessitate admitting his initial evaluation was flawed, something his system cannot tolerate. Simultaneously, Russia cannot achieve conventional victory, as its military has consistently proven inadequate against a smaller, NATO-trained Ukrainian force. He also cannot negotiate from advantage since Russia is surrendering territory in counteroffensives. Atomic threats are literally Putin's final remaining instrument to project authority. They serve 4 primary objectives, which render them quite valuable when employed. But this implies sparing and deliberate usage, something we've yet to observe. Primarily, they can divert attention from military catastrophes. Each time Russia experiences major battlefield defeat, the atomic rhetoric intensifies. For instance, if Russia cannot capture Pokrovsk, it tests a new missile that could coincidentally level the entire city. When Russia began surrendering occupied territories, or even experienced invasion by Ukraine, suddenly that became an illegitimate maneuver, warranting atomic response not exclusively on Ukraine, but also its allies. Classic misdirection. Secondly, atomic threats do intimidate risk-averse Western authorities. They are democratically elected and accountable to constituents who naturally fear atomic conflict. This renders them prime candidates for pressure to withdraw from vital NATO resolutions that would deliver additional packages and modern equipment to Ukraine. Yet even this strategy functions increasingly less frequently in 2025, as most of Europe united to enhance military preparedness and distribute NATO leadership burdens. Third, Russian state media amplifies every atomic threat, portraying Putin as a powerful leader restraining Western aggression. For a Russian audience consuming Kremlin propaganda, these threats constitute proof that Russia remains a superpower, disregarding actual military performance. Finally, Putin's grip on authority rests upon several hundred critical individuals: security services, military command, and oligarchs. These individuals require believing Putin is prevailing, or at minimum, not catastrophically failing. Atomic threats function as evidence that Russia still possesses cards to play, even as the conventional conflict deteriorates. The Atlantic Council articulated it perfectly. Putin has become a geopolitical gangster, while English financier and political activist Bill Browder compared Putin to a mafia boss, or like the most brutal guy in the prison yard, to disguise Russia's steadily eroding military capabilities. Like a gangster who's forfeited his muscle, yet still attempts intimidating through reputation alone, Putin threatens consequences he's increasingly unable and unwilling to deliver. But let's address the evident question. If Putin is so desperate, what prevents him from actually employing atomic weapons? The answer is straightforward. Even Putin comprehends how suicidal that would be. Here's what would realistically transpire if Russia employed even a solitary 10-kiloton tactical atomic weapon in Ukraine. Within seconds, everything within a half-mile radius is vaporized. The city, let's say Zaporizhia, with its 700,000 inhabitants, is effectively annihilated. Within minutes, radiation detection systems across Europe register the detonation. Secure communication channels between Kiev, Washington, London, Paris, and Berlin are activating. Russia has crossed the atomic threshold. Share this video with anyone who needs to understand what's really happening. Truth matters. NATO would almost certainly declare this an act requiring immediate response. Not because NATO desires atomic war, but because permitting Russia to employ atomic weapons with impunity would demolish the nuclear non-proliferation framework that has prevented atomic war for nearly 80 years. The principle is termed escalate to de-escalate in military terminology, but the reality is considerably simpler. If you permit someone employing atomic weapons once without massive repercussions, they'll employ them again, and the subsequent target might be you. And eventually, someone else will employ them too. So NATO would be compelled to respond. Perhaps it launches massive conventional strikes against Russian forces in Ukraine. Perhaps it employs tactical atomic weapons of its own, targeted at Russian military installations. Perhaps it declares direct war against Russia. Putin, confronting the collapse of his regime and possible defeat, decides that if he's descending, he might as well take the planet with him. So he authorizes a complete atomic exchange, which the remainder of the world reciprocates in kind. Within an hour, hundreds of atomic warheads are airborne. Cities across Russia, the United States, and Europe are obliterated. Within hours, tens of millions of individuals are deceased from the immediate explosions. Within days, the death toll escalates as radiation sickness proliferates and fires rage uncontrolled through destroyed cities. Within weeks, 150 million tons of smoke and soot penetrate the stratosphere, initiating atomic winter. Within 6 months, global temperatures decline noticeably. Crop failures commence. Within 2 years, global temperatures have decreased by 14 degrees Celsius, and agricultural production collapses worldwide. Within a decade, an estimated 5 billion individuals will be deceased, most from starvation rather than atomic weapons. Modern civilization has collapsed. The survivors confront a radioactive planet where vast regions remain uninhabitable for generations. So why won't Putin do it? First and foremost, Putin wants to prevail. He wants Russia to be feared and respected as a great power. He wants to restore what he perceives as Russia's rightful sphere of influence. Employing atomic weapons doesn't accomplish any of these objectives. It terminates them. An atomic strike on Ukraine would accomplish 4 things. Destroy the very territory and population Russia claims it's attempting to liberate. Guarantee NATO's direct participation in the conflict. Almost certainly result in Putin's own death, either from NATO retaliation or from his own security services, removing him to preserve themselves. Eliminate any remaining international support, including from China and India. Putin is many things, but he's not completely irrational. He comprehends that employing atomic weapons essentially terminates his regime and possibly Russia as a whole. The second consideration originates from outside Russia. At the G20 summit in Bali in November 2022, when Russia's situation around Kherson was becoming desperate, President Biden met with Chinese President Xi Jinping. Intelligence indicates Xi directly instructed Putin not to employ atomic weapons. China's opposition matters enormously. Russia's economy increasingly depends on Chinese trade, especially for oil and gas exports that Western sanctions have restricted. If China turned against Russia over atomic use, Putin would confront complete economic isolation. China has its own motivations for opposing atomic weapons use. It establishes a precedent that could apply to Taiwan. It threatens the global economic system that China benefits from, and it risks atomic escalation that could threaten Chinese interests. Third, Putin invaded Ukraine because he desires Ukraine, be it its population, its resources, its strategic position, its industrial capacity, or most likely all of the above. An atomic weapon simply destroys what you're attempting to capture, rendering the territory temporarily uninhabitable and eliminating the population you claim to be protecting. If Putin's objective was simple destruction, he could have employed atomic weapons on day one. The fact that he hasn't, despite nearly 4 years of conflict and countless boundary transgressions, demonstrates that he still believes he can secure Ukraine conventionally or pressure the West into accepting a favorable peace agreement. Employing an atomic weapon would essentially be admitting total defeat. If you cannot prevail and you'd rather destroy what you cannot possess, you've abandoned the original objectives. Finally, there's a somewhat solemn truth that Putin's atomic blackmail has been partially successful. Germany still refuses to provide Taurus cruise missiles. The US delayed ATACMS delivery for 20 months. F-16s arrived far later than Ukraine requested. Every weapon system undergoes a lengthy debate where Western officials carefully weigh escalation risks. This cautious approach has cost Ukraine. Imagine if Ukraine had received ATACMS, F-16s, and long-range missiles in mid-2022 during its successful Kharkiv counteroffensive. The conflict might appear very different. Instead, Russian atomic threat successfully delayed, though didn't halt, Western assistance. Hit that like button if you're still with us. This matters more than ever. So the moment Putin decides to employ an atomic weapon, one of two scenarios happens. Either NATO responds with overwhelming force and Russia forfeits everything, or NATO retreats and reveals that atomic blackmail functions even better than anyone thought. Putin's not wagering his life on that coin flip. He's extracting more mileage from the threats than he would from actual employment. All of this assumes Putin remains rational. It assumes he doesn't reach a point where he believes his regime is doomed regardless and decides to exit in apocalyptic glory. It assumes no miscalculation, no accident, no moment of desperation where he genuinely believes atomic escalation is his sole option. Take the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962. It nearly went atomic because of miscommunication and brinksmanship. We avoided atomic war through fortune as much as skill. Every time Putin rattles the atomic saber, there's a non-zero probability something goes wrong. All it requires is one excessively aggressive response, and we're back to the Cuban crisis all over again. And the more times Putin or his subordinates threaten, the more opportunities for error. It's like playing Russian roulette repeatedly. The initial few times, the odds are in your favor. But eventually, probability catches up. Meanwhile, Putin's domestic situation grows more precarious. The Russian economy is hemorrhaging capital, as Russia has been compelled to admit that it needs to reduce defense spending for the first time in years. Oil and gas revenue that made Russia wealthy from the 2000s onward is beginning to deplete, with a 35% year-over-year decline in revenue and a 17% decrease in refining capacity in mid-2025. If Putin's regime begins to collapse, he might think there's nothing else to forfeit. This is why Trump's dismissive approach, while satisfying, carries hazards. You want to call Putin's bluff without forcing him into a corner where he feels atomic use is his sole option. You want to provide Ukraine with what it needs to prevail while maintaining off-ramps for Russian de-escalation. The fundamental problem is that atomic weapons exist to prevent their own use. Deterrence functions when both sides believe the other will actually employ atomic weapons in response to certain actions. If you convince your adversary you'd never use atomic weapons under any circumstances, you've forfeited deterrence. If you convince them you might use atomic weapons over minor provocations, you've created instability. Putin is attempting to exploit this system. He wants the West to believe he might employ atomic weapons to deter support for Ukraine, while never actually having to prove it, because employing them would terminate his regime. The West's response has been to gradually test these threats, crossing boundaries incrementally to demonstrate they're hollow. First HIMARS, then tanks, then ATACMS, then F-16s. Each time Russia threatens, nothing happens, and the threats lose credibility. In the end, Putin will almost certainly continue making atomic threats. They're the sole tool he has left. But the West is no longer paralyzed by these threats. Comment below with your thoughts. Engagement helps us continue this critical work. Trump's dismissive response, Britain's determination to keep supporting Ukraine, Germany's rearmament, and Europe's coalition of the willing, providing $40 billion, or $46 billion in military aid, all demonstrate that Putin's atomic blackmail is losing its power. The conflict in Ukraine will be decided by economics, logistics, military technology, and political will. And on every one of those metrics, Russia is losing ground. The trajectory is clear. Moscow's conventional forces continue underperforming. Its economy strains under sanctions and war expenditures, and its international standing deteriorates. Putin's atomic threats, once feared as potential triggers for global catastrophe, now appear as what they truly are: the final desperate card of a leader who miscalculated catastrophically and now finds himself with no viable path to victory. The world is watching, and increasingly, the world is calling the bluff. Each transgressed boundary that produces no atomic response further diminishes Moscow's credibility. Each weapon system delivered to Ukraine that Putin threatened would trigger apocalyptic retaliation proves that his warnings are hollow theater designed for domestic consumption and Western intimidation, but increasingly effective at neither. Subscribe to our channel for daily updates on the geopolitical developments reshaping global power dynamics. Share this video, hit the notification bell, and join us as we continue analyzing the conflict that's redefining international security in the 21st century. Your engagement makes this work possible.